Thank you for the time. This Sarah Wilks is a boat builder and oceanographer, just finished a PhD at Macquarie Uni, and she's actually walked the miles as well as done the talk. She's walked the walk. She's actually been around the world in a yacht and studied the ocean at close quarters all the way around, so she should know a fair bit about it, looking for plastic bags and things. So I think without further ado, I'll just introduce her and leave her to speak to you. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, great. Okay. Right. There you are. Just to start with. Having done that, I'd just like to start with some definitions because some of these terms I'm going to be using. Activism, we have activists. It's not to connote a value judgment, but that's what I mean when I talk about activism. Science, I view science as objective and verifiable, reproducible. Perhaps other people don't, but that's the context I'm using it in today. Hence, we have hard knowledge, which I'll also refer to as quantitative information. This is scientific and technical data. I'm making this distinction because a lot of the information I'm drawing upon is what we could call soft knowledge, which is qualitative data. And this can be a value statement, it can be an I believe this, it can also be informally stated hard data. It's important to draw these distinctions because a lot of the work I've done rests on a technique called qualitative analysis or discourse analysis. Are there any social scientists here? Okay, you know what I'm talking about then. Qualitative analysis is a way of looking at data, which are text, is words. It's through words that people can express what they believe, how they believe the world to be, the things they believe, the values that they have embedded in their statements, where they're coming from, where they want to go to. Discourse analysis is a more rigorous form of qualitative analysis where you systematically go through your data to look for recurrent themes, and then you can attempt to link those to wider discourses about the world. So, for example, you could look at the forestry debate and link that into sustainability issues. You could link that into discourses about the intrinsic value of the environment and other sorts of things. I'd like to sell the method because I've seen a couple of really good studies done with genetically modified foods where a lot of textual responses to a website the British government set up asking people what they thought about genetic foods and why. And this lady did this so really well that it inspired me to go on and do this with a couple of case studies. So what I've done with the work in my thesis is I've taken a case study approach and I've done a qualitative analysis of the discourse around a particular issue, and then followed it up with a scientific or technical analysis of the issues that have been raised. So just briefly, there'll be two case studies which I'm just going to throw at you just basically to say this is what I'm basing my data on. The voices of activism came through quite clearly in these case studies, and I want to dwell on that a little bit, and then there's a couple of other things I want to pick up on before the conclusion. So the first thing I looked at, I have to stand still, don't I? Disposable or cloth nappies. We've probably all seen these messages that, you know, disposables of bad cloth is good, they fill up landfills, they use up trees, they can harm babies, they can do all sorts of things. Cloth is good, cotton is natural, cotton performs better, it's not really hard work, you're not washing nappies, you just need to be educated as a parent. All of these things have come out from a qualitative analysis of a very great deal of textual information, including interview transcripts, hospital guidelines, baby care books, websites, common wisdom in media programs and things like that, even politicians, environment ministers. Now this is something that we should be able to answer. This isn't hard. All of these claims we should be able to find evidence to back them up or evidence to refute them. We use life cycle analysis for this. It's an environmental engineering approach. It's essentially a huge mass balance equation. You add up what goes in, you take your raw materials, you take your energy flows, you add up what comes out, you try and quantify byproducts, any emissions, you follow your product through after use to its disposal and then post-disposal issues. And It's got its problems, especially with the scoping issue and with some of the data that's used, but it's a pretty reliable tool. So all of the above points from the discourse analysis were considered, and after several weeks of modelling, I came up with this lovely table. And incidentally, just after I came up with this lovely table, the UK Environment Agency came up with one very similar. We look at the greenhouse gas emissions in this column here. Whether you put your child in disposables, wash your nappies at home, or use a commercial nappy wash service, the emissions are in the same ballpark, with the exception of the home laundered ones, which is sensitive to what sort of washing machine you use, basically, whether you use a water and energy efficient one or not. Another big issue that came up was the water use. These impacts are in different areas. The disposables, the impact tend to be in the pulp production. The commercial laundry, obviously, it's in the washing process. The waste issues, and this was really prominent, that this idea that they fill up landfills, despite the fact that 2 Eastern State Environment Ministers looked me in the eye and told me that disposable nappies are 15% of household waste. They're actually not. If you go to a suburb with lots of young families, they're about 3%. And if you squash them, they end up in the interstices between the baked bean tins in the landfill, and they simply aren't a problem in the landfill, no matter what the discourse analysis tells us. There are no significant waste issues with the other systems. So, what does this tell us? Did you know you should have a label on this? Backwards and forwards? There are other outstanding issues from the soft data set, so they're supposed to be harmful, well they're not. They're supposed to be bad for skincare, and they're not. So they're not using great tracts of forest because they tend to use plantation thinnings. Cotton isn't especially natural, as probably most people would know. Washing and drying them takes up about half an hour a day. That's 182 hours a year, and I don't think anyone really wants to do that. But when you do a full cost analysis, it's actually not cheap either. So the message from this is that even though most of the population are using disposable nappies, they're feeling guilty, and all these official messages from environment agencies to hospitals to baby care books are still telling them that they're wrong and that they shouldn't be doing this. This was quite a bounded case. It did demonstrate the methodology quite well. And then I went on to another case which was a little bit more diffuse. And I want to be quite quick about this because I know Stan's talking about this lot next. Is there anyone who hasn't seen this image? Oh, I'm surprised. Is this a mainland or island thing, I wonder? Because it was quite prominent in the campaign to ban plastic bags. And here's the poster boy. The analysis of the discourse told us lots of interesting things. That there are lots of plastic bags which are only ever used once, they end up in the environment and they basically kill marine mammals and do terrible harm. And we don't need these things anyway, and we can easily do without them. It's just a little change, and if we really cared, we'd do it. Australians are fed up with all the plastic bags all over the place because they are all over the place. This is what the discourse analysis tells us. Other alternatives are far more environmentally friendly, and that Australians really do care about the environment. So I took those claims. I know Stan will be talking more on these. And I went into the literature, and with a background in marine sciences, it was the marine end of things I looked at first. And there's a lot of plastic in the ocean. Most of it's not plastic bag related. Most of it comes from localised sources. You might get a near-shore source that's related to recreational use of a beach. You get fishery-related litter, which is unequivocally related to that fishery. And you get in the open ocean a lot of stuff that apparently is dumped over the side of ocean ships. You get big sacks of rice, big bottles of detergent, those sorts of things. Plastic is really dangerous to critters in the environment, but it's not because it chokes them. It's dangerous because it does degrade photochemically and mechanically to smaller and smaller pieces, which are picked up by filter feeders, which are then eaten by the next thing up the food chain and the next, until you get the situation where, as in some studies, there was a seal with 30% plastic in its stomach. Now, the plastic's not bad for the seal, it's in tiny little pieces, but it's filling its stomach up and reducing the animal's fitness. So it is actually a problem, but we probably can't blame plastic bags for that. The next thing that I looked at was the reuse data, and they are actually reused quite a lot. Then I looked at the source of the original claims, and I know Stan's going to go into this in a huge amount of detail. But there are problems with the claims that the whole campaign was founded upon, that they really are a huge number of litter, just hasn't been measured. Where is the data coming from for all this? Also, there's not really any evidence that Australians really care all that much about the environment. There's some nice New South Wales data which says in New South Wales people know that cars adversely affect air quality. They prefer that air quality would be improved, and they say that if there was an environmental rating on their car, it would influence their purchase price. But guess what they're buying? They're just not buying these environmental cars, as SUVs are going up and they only blip down when the petrol prices go up. It's just not a factor. In both of these case studies, I found that there was some, there were some loud voices coming through, and these were activist voices. And statements that are released by activist groups have got a habit of becoming embedded into the discourse, and once they're there, it's almost impossible to pry them out again. And one example of this was a statement by Greenpeace about 10 years ago, which said that organotins are present in babies' nappies. There was a huge scramble all over the world, mainly in Europe, but also here, to reproduce these, because if it was true, it could be a potential problem. Nobody was ever able to reproduce those data. When Greenpeace were asked for the data, they just basically said, we've moved on. And this is a legitimate, but this is a legitimate tactic in the eyes of many of the activists that I've interviewed. And I've interviewed a lot of them. I've interviewed some who are so mainstream and benign that they have lunch with politicians in Canberra. And I've interviewed one guy who was on a police wanted poster the next morning for breaking into an animal research facility and letting all the chickens out. So I have interviewed a lot of these activists, and this is a very, very familiar claim that it's all right to do this because we can move on and it keeps industry or business or whatever scrabbling to cover their bums. Now, you can cut activism a lot of ways, and there's been a fair amount written about it. This is my cut, because this is what I've seen, that activism goes into 5 groups. And we're talking about activism to do with the environment here. You get the awareness raisers. These are the people that climb the wall of Lucas Heights, Greenpeace, they bung up pipes. You get direct action groups, and these come in lots of different guises. They might be bushcare groups, or they might be people like SHAC, that's Stop Hunting and Animal Cruelty. These people get balaclavas and they go around, put things on their heads and they go around with baseball bats and smash the windows of the managing director at home. These are direct action groups. You get the facilitators groups, and this is how the groups are describing themselves, by the way. These are people that work with government in the business sector. Good examples are Planet Ark and here in Australia. Then there's a group of focused or single issue organisations, and these tend to be values or ethics led. The Australian Koala Foundation is a very good example of that. It fights for koalas everywhere and nothing else. And finally, you get the quiet, silent types. These are respectable, respected by politicians, may not have a high profile, but most people have probably heard of them at the end of the day. You take that cut of 5, and you can cut it again into where they're coming from and where they're going to. And if we stick 3 dimensions here, money going in directors' salaries and cars and things, and flashy lunches, money going in campaign effort, and where the values are, and you try and plot where these organisations are, they'll all be in pretty different places. You know, some of them are going to be up here and some of them are going to be out there. But it's a valid question to ask. Where does the money come from and where's it going to? Not all of these groups are transparent, although some of them are. Some of them are admirable groups, but some of them are not transparent at all. And it's probably worth mentioning at this stage that I've actually been threatened with legal action by 2 of these groups after having participated in the project because they simply didn't like something I said at the seminar once, which I think that's a bit off. You can also ask, what is a group not saying? And I'm going to pick the Australian Koala Foundation here because it's just the best example I have to hand. This is a group that fights for the rights of all koalas everywhere, even if they happen to be on an island where they were introduced and they're eating themselves to death and the trees are dying and they're falling on the road dead of starvation. Because to admit that these animals are overabundant in some places damages the potential for funding flows which can be directed to places where they are endangered. So they spend a lot of time going tut 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 about urban sprawl and about land clearing, but they actually don't seem to be doing anything like habitat preservation or effective education. So I think it's quite valid to go to a group like that and say, well, what are you really doing for the environment? Where are you coming from? They don't like it when you ask them that. And the other thing that came quite clearly is that these are political acts. I liked the comment that was made yesterday that science isn't a debate. Scientific process isn't a debate, but sooner or later, as scientists, we actually have to take our outputs and synthesise a worldview that other people will look at. And that might be just a peer-reviewed paper. It might be a funding application that goes through the ARC, which is still looked at by your peers. Or it might be an advice to a minister. It might be a media article. And guess what? Once it gets out there, it is in fact a debate. It's subject to debate. And that's got its own problems. Because politics, this is what politics is. It's a process of adjudicating different positions on an issue. And this can include all sorts of things that, as scientists, we might not relate to, including horoscopes. And it's all fair and it's all allowed. They all go into the melting pot. They all go equally. Perhaps the economic perspective get a little bit of precedence in the current climate, but essentially, once you're 10 years of data get into the political process, there's no guarantee it's going to be taken any more seriously than yesterday's horoscope. So there's a problem here with the natures of politics and the natures of science, because in politics, value positions are allowed. Sometimes they're explicitly allowed, sometimes they're implicitly allowed, and we like to get politicians to declare pecuniary interest, for example, so that we can tell where they're coming from. And that's politics, and everybody accepts that. But when we have a science debate, we can't. The values tend to be either actively suppressed or camouflaged behind a technical argument. And there's still this idea that scientific facts are completely detached from values. And linked to this, there's the expectation that scientific information will guide rational decision-making about the world. Now that manifestly isn't true, but it persists, and I saw that in my interviews on all sides of the debate. I saw activists expecting this, politicians and industry people expecting it. This belief is quite strong. As scientists, we don't like to believe that our work is socially positioned, and some sociologists in science take this to extremes. But I think it's silly to argue there's no social or political influence, even if you look at who gets funded and who doesn't. Going back to something like the white paper, Innovation and Knowledge, it laid out very clearly what was going to get funded during the time of that white paper. And so there's a problem, and you get strongly held values, which might be a choking dolphin or a poor turtle with plastic in its mouth, and it's going on head-to-head with a fairly dry and appealing scientific facts. The values win. That's a very large button for activists to push, and they're very well aware that it's there, and they're quite happy to push it. I saw that with the choking whale and the turtle, and also the fears that babies are going to be hurt by things in disposable nappies is really very powerful. I don't know how we get around that. It's definitely there. Now, a few other considerations before I go away. I was going to talk about something that was talked about beautifully yesterday, so I don't have to. Most people don't know enough science. We've all heard that before. I'd like to share this with you. A recent study of primary school teachers. They spend more than half their time teaching English and maths, 4% on assemblies, 4% teaching religion, 3% teaching science. Okay, that's primary school. But shouldn't science start at primary school anyway? We have knowledge limitations. The dissent was covered so beautifully by Sagai yesterday. I was actually going to bring up the Longbourn book, just to make the point that when there is dissent and it's so vitriolic and personal, it doesn't actually serve anyone, because the general public and non-scientists are just going to say that, oh, someone else said this yesterday as well, come back when you sort it out. When you agree, when you've got a single message, then come back and tell us. The other issue, of course, is that there are uncertainties. There are things we don't know, things we can't measure. There's uncertainty in much scientific process. And so we don't have perfect knowledge. And sometimes, I think sometimes it's assumed that the knowledge is more perfect and complete than it is. There are trust issues. The scientists that failed to foresee long-term toxicity of certain chemicals and now can't clean them up aren't trusted. It's interesting to see who people do trust. 90% of people think that what the environmental conservation group says is reliable. Anyone got any ideas who is not trusted?
Lawyers.
Lawyers? Politicians? This is a New South Wales Department of Environment and Conservation survey, and business and industry were thought to be unreliable by 60% of people. So for the, if you have a situation where a business or an industry perceives itself to be under attack, and this has also been said here, it doesn't really matter what you say because they're not going to believe you anyway, because you're business and industry. If you're a Planet Art campaigner, you're automatically truthful and reliable. If you stand there because you're from a business, you're not truthful. And the other thing that's slightly worrying is that newspaper and television are overwhelmingly considered to be the main source of information about environmental issues. One tactic of Planet Ark and Clean Up Australia, in particular with the plastic bags, has been to maximise media coverage, so it's fairly obvious where that leads. And the last thing is the value of trade-offs. Most people aren't happy with the trade-off, and solutions environmental debates very often involve them. And there is a value judgment there in the trade-off, and there's all sorts of dangers inherent with the trade-offs. No one's going to be happy at the end of the day quite often. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that. Everyone in the environmental debates, the two that I very quickly went over and the other ones I've looked at, all parties were trying to abstract bits of science to support their cause. I think there's something about scientific information that permits a loss of context, and that's because we like to be able to reduce things to a graph or a table or an answer. It doesn't tend to be full of words and waffle, and that does permit taking a number out of context. When scientific information collides with other interests, especially value statements, it's often the loser. And a dolphin choking on a plastic bag is attention grabbing. A full cost-benefit analysis of getting rid of plastic bags is just dry and unappealing and boring, and most people aren't going to read it. And it's an attention issue as much as anything else. Some environmental activism is democratically unrepresentative. I have a huge problem with this when I'm told that the community wants this or the community wants that, and it's actually a very slick professional PR person who's telling me that this is what the community wants, and then when I go and look in the ADS data, there's no evidence for this whatsoever. But I guess the last thing I can say is that an understanding of science is also democratically unrepresentative. And thank you. Can I turn this off? Not very good at that.
There's plenty of time for questions. Anybody have a question?
Yes. Just at the beginning of your talk, you made a distinction between hard knowledge and soft knowledge.
Yes.
This does not seem to be sustainable to me. I'd argue that there is only knowledge.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as degrees of knowledge or degrees of factuality. If something is the case, then that's it. I'm happy to go along with the distinction between qualitative and quantitative methods of inquiry, but this in no way comes from this alleged distinction between different kinds of knowledge, hard and soft knowledge.
Well, the distinction there is so that I can make it clear when I'm speaking or writing about scientific and technical information, or whether I'm talking about what everybody knows or what their horoscope told them this morning.
Find a different label.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Qualitative and quantitative is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But it is knowledge. It can be qualitative knowledge, but it is knowledge.
Well, where's the hardness and softness?
It's in the human mind. The knowledge is sort of chiselled in stone in the sky or something. It's a fact, but the way my grandmother perceives it, she may actually know the fact, or she may just think she knows it, or just like the forest anyway or something, and there's degrees of fuzziness, surely.
Yeah.
That's what you mean by the softness.
That's absolutely. Yeah, it's knowledge, it's relating the data that come out of the discourse analysis that relate to people's feelings and their values. If you can come up with a better label, I'll use it, certainly.
Question up there.
Well, if you were to sort of imply that hard knowledge is somehow more reliable or more true, you only need to take a bit of a scientific perspective to say that, well, phlogiston was probably hard scientific knowledge at its time. What did the perhaps uncritical acceptance of phlogiston do to scientific inquiry at that time? Did it sort of close the field on the nature of heat?
Well, the phlogiston theory is a very good example of what sociologists call a grounded theory, where bits of knowledge are discovered and they're bolted onto the theory, and bolted on and bolted on and bolted on. I love phlogiston theory because it exactly illustrates the point between social science inductive reasoning and hard science deductive reasoning.
Surely it seems to me that there's a confusion here between knowledge and belief. Now, most of the things you are calling knowledge that are not in fact specific numerical data are mere beliefs. People believe this and they believe that about plastic bags and their effect on the environment. Now, whether or not those beliefs are true or not is the important point. But there's not two grades of knowledge, in my view. It's either known or it's believed.
Okay, this is a problem that this is why many of my colleagues hate this work. If I took this work to a sociologist conference, people would be screaming at me for using hard and scientific to imply that there's anything objective, verifiable and knowing about the world, because they would argue that knowledge is different for all knowers, and that what you see as yellow sodium emissions is in fact subjective and not objective. This is the difficulty with working between disciplines, trying to learn two languages.
Well, it seems to me you're working with a discipline and a belief system. To me, I suspect it's a little different from a religion.
But the world works between knowledge and belief.
Well, indeed, but you should be clear in the definition. I believe, well, certainly what you were saying did confuse me, and it's a bit clearer now. But it does seem to me fairly certain that knowledge of things which are falsifiable, all else is cultural, beliefs, things like that.
I think you also argue for a hardened skeptic position when you go back to the ancient Greeks about whether you can even have knowledge. I mean, if you know that water boils at 100 degrees, such as that, people have seen that. If you know that lead melts at 3 to 7 degrees, most people have not actually done an experiment. They're relying on an appeal to authority. They've read it in a book somewhere that lead melts at that temperature.
But it is falsifiable. That's the important point. You can prove it.
Okay, it's
if you fail
falsifiable.
to prove it wrong.
But the level a person has of that knowledge, they're relying on somebody else having done the experiment, and they actually don't know it at first hand, they know it at second hand.
Perhaps Professor Hill's observations yesterday are very germane.
Any more questions?
Hi. First, I'd like to apologise for my humanities background, so I know where you're coming from in terms of the conflict you get on both sides.
Welcome.
Yeah, hi.
I'm a scientist.
Getting there. Firstly, the point that you made about science education, I know that Primary Connections is attempting to address the balance in terms of how little science is understood, or more accurately taught, by primary school teachers. But I also know that there's been research into teachers' beliefs, which certainly could be very much influenced by the points you made about activists being seen as the kind, cuddly, friendly, out there going guys whilst politicians boo. Is there any way that you think this might actually enable us to meet halfway, or will Primary Connections, in your opinion, is just pushing too much against an overwhelming wave of media pressure and societal pressure to see the activists as right on.
I'm really not sure how you could address that, to be quite honest. Realistically, yeah, I'd like to see science taught more effectively. I'm qualified to teach physics to HSC level in New South Wales. I've never studied physics beyond year 10 myself. But because I have a science degree and a teaching diploma, I can teach people HSC physics. I don't know anything about physics, I don't understand physics, and if I had to teach physics, I would be putting up a formula on the board and filling in the numbers, which is not the best way to teach a science. And while that position still exists, I don't know what you can do about that.
You're teaching it. Your question, yes.
No, you've identified a whole stack of problems between activism and science, but you haven't given us any suggestions what the hell we can do about it. Have you got any suggestions for us?
I've been wrestling with this for a while. I like the idea of having trained science communicators. I think that's really important. I know there was a master's course at Newcastle University at one stage, and they may still be running it, where they train people to be effective communicators in science. I think that's a really good idea. Scientists and engineers are trusted by the general public, perhaps not quite as much as activists, but a lot more than business and industry people. So if we can get more effective science communication going on, I think that would go a long way towards it. But then when you get a show axed because it's got science in it, then it's really, it's quite demoralising.
So I just echo that, because Robin Williams in the recent Australasian Science said exactly the same thing about encouraging science communicators. I also noticed that ANU as well, who produced the CSIRO Science Circus group and encouraged a degree in science communication. That's also another possible option. Maybe more of this in every state should be identified and supported.
It's important.
Yeah.
I would suggest taking to the streets with a baseball bat and stuff.
I was going to say that, but...
Sorry, question up there.
Probably not so much a question, but the one lesson that we can learn from all of the activists is that they sure know how to market themselves. They know how to communicate with their audience, and I think for the science people, we really do need to start learning a little bit from the enemy.
Oh, you're dead right.
Yeah.
And now we know how they do it.
Because as somebody, I'm quite good at communicating because I'm a humanities teacher background, but I don't know enough science to be able to get the message simplified, and a lot of my science friends can't make the language simple enough for me to understand it without losing the plot totally. So that's the dilemma.
Yeah.
Question in the middle there.
Yeah, just two points. One I hope doesn't offend too many people. It's the negative one, then there's a positive one. I come from a long line of sort of Scots Presbyterian teachers, a long line of them where teaching was a very high profile, high prestige, high status thing. It's not anymore. Part of the problem is that, at UQ, we get the top students in the state in law and then medicine, and I can tell you how far down teaching is. And I'm not even sure I want my own kids to go into teaching. And part of the problem is, I don't know how you turn that around, but teaching is not getting the best students. There are anomalies, but there are anomalies. The best students are not going into teaching. That's a problem. The upside, my positive outlook one is, I don't know, I've got kids who are 13 and 11. Isn't Mythbusters a great show? Yeah. It is a great show. We need more shows like that. I mean, kids just glued to it, they get it, they understand how the testing goes. I think it's the best thing on TV.
So I think also Mythbusters is harking back to when things were dangerous. I was in a bookshop reading the dangerous book for boys. It's how to make a secret code, how to follow on, how to make a catapult, and how to do things, anything except watch TV, because nobody does these things anymore.
How to make a car bomb.
Yeah. No kid does this. They're not allowed. Yeah, question at the back there. So.
What should we do about the activists? I don't think they're the enemy. I think we need them. I think the world of activists are in a pretty dismal place. How do we keep them honest?
I also think we need activists. I do think we need to open up activism, and I think that it's really grossly unfair that business and industry is subject to things like trade practices legislation. When they say something, they have to be able to back it up. It has to be truthful and so on. whereas an activist group can just say what they've done, well, please. And I suggest some way of redressing that might help. I think that would help a lot. And I think financial transparency should be mandated. Actually, I think you should be able to open the books and have a look at these organisations, see where the money is coming from and where it goes to.
Good idea.
I think it's quite over the top now to be talking about honesty not applying to activism but applying to science. I mean, there's a long history of unholy alliances between science and very regressive and powerful forces such as eugenics, invasion, colonisation, the incredible development of industrial-based monocultures. I think the reason possibly that science is not quite as believable as activism is that it's had that history and that people clearly see that science can be corrupted and can be co-opted very easily.
And mad scientists, as mad scientists, it's a common theme.
At the back there.
Just on the point, I mean, in Tasmania we've had, for example, the Guns 20 litigation where...
Sorry, I can't...
Sorry. Yeah, in Tasmania, I mean, it does go both ways. We've had an example with the Guns 20 litigation where Guns, the large Tasmanian company, is suing environmental activists, a doctor whose crime was to suggest that perhaps the large wood chip pile at Burnie might have health implications, might be an area where Legionella disease. So, I mean, I think it's not true to say that activists are entirely unaccountable. I mean, if their books would be audited, if they're claiming tax deductibility, those sorts of processes, I agree with you that there should be free-flowing public debate and nobody should be sued for saying things if they can then verify them. But I don't think it's just a one-way.
No, I don't think it's one way. Some of the case studies that I've looked at, two of the organisations I've worked quite closely with can only be described as dishonest. I'm sorry, but they are, and everyone in the room would have heard of one of them, may not have heard of the other.
Yeah, I'm sure there are dishonest activist groups.
And there are some very honest activist groups as well, yeah.
The final comment from at the back there.
Sarah, I was talking to somebody at lunchtime. There are two groups that we as a group of skeptics talk to. There are charlatans and there are zealots. Now, charlatans are easy to deal with. Charlatans know their crooks. And if you threaten to confront them, they'll run away rather than confront you. They're pretty nasty people at times, but nonetheless, they're easy to overcome. Zealots, on the other hand, sort of some of the activists you're talking about, and I like that. I've heard the arguments about whether there are two kinds of knowledge. These people know what their knowledge is, and it doesn't matter whether it's factual or not. It's what they know. It's their zealotry. It's a religious impulse, and that's what I think you're talking about. And that is very worrying that those people are around, because in the end, if you confront a zealot, they're just as likely to kill you as do anything else.
That's true. Some of them are zealots. Some of them, as I said for the last question, are actually just dishonest bastards.